All right, we are on time and let's get this workshop started. So welcome everyone to the workshop. We have Ben with us. Ben is a developer advocate at Auth0 and he will teach us how to use Auth0 with Gatsby and also add Auth0 to our Express API. So yeah, this is going to be a very fun session where you will get to learn and you can use Auth0 in your hack as well. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having fun so far. I know it's early on in the hackathon, and I'm very grateful to be here and to be sharing some helpful tips, hopefully, on making authentication and identity an easy part of your silly hack. I'm just going to find that share screen thing again. There we go. This is me. So my name is Ben Dechrai. As mentioned, I work for Auth0 as a developer advocate. I come from a PHP development background, but I've been a front-end developer now for many years as well. And I've been working, yesterday was actually my 2-year anniversary at Auth0, so that was very exciting. It's a great place to work and it's a great product to use. If you want to get in touch with me at any point throughout the hackathon, I'm going to be keeping an eye on Discord a little bit. My colleague Sam Julien, who you saw during the opening session, will actually be doing more of the mentoring. I'm doing the workshop and helping out with some of the judging. So we're splitting the load up between us a little. But if I see any questions coming through over the weekend, I'm more than happy to help out. And if you want to get in touch any other way, my DMs on Twitter are open. That's a good way of getting in touch with me too. The thing that I want to talk about today is implementing Auth0 as an identity product within your hack. I'm going to pick specifically on Gatsby or React, which is what Gatsby is based on, as a front-end technology, because front-end technology, single-page apps, especially React, are very popular nowadays. If it's not what you're planning on using, don't worry, the SDKs and the documentation we have for a whole lot of different stacks are available. This will just give you an idea of what it's like to implement into a front end. And then obviously, if you are doing a single page app, you're probably going to need to write your own API. So we'll build an API as well. In fact, I have a very simple front end and API built already, which we'll go through and have a look at just so you understand what it's doing. My focus in this session is not to help you write an API or the front end itself, but to help you build the identity and security into it. So if you want to follow along, I'll just post this into the chat, which is over here somewhere. There we go. So if you want to, I've just pasted that into the Zoom chat, which I'll move over here so I can see any questions coming through as well. Actually, that just went to all panelists, so I'll send that to all panelists and attendees. So everyone should have that now. At any point, if you've got any questions you want me to stop, raise your hand, ask a question in the chat. I'm more than happy to take this really dynamically and make sure that you get your questions answered if you have any. So if you grab this GitHub repository and you download it, the README that I've written will actually take you through the whole process of setting this up. If you want to do this in your own spare time, or if you're watching the video of this afterwards, the main thing to look at is I've created 3 different branches here. So we're going to be starting with a main branch in this workshop. And we're going to be building up what I've done for the auth branch and the RBAC, which is the role-based access control mechanism. So if we switch to RBAC, just for example's sake, if you're doing this in your own time, you'll see the instructions have changed because now it's got more information in there on how to set up roles and how to set up permissions in Auth0 and how to configure your application and your API to listen to those roles. But we'll get to that by the end of today's session. So I'm actually going to just check out the main branch. If you want to follow along and do this in your own time as well, or rather while we're doing this, then please do so. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a git clone. I'm going to grab the ye olde shoppy repository we were just looking at, and I'm going to clone that into a directory called SillyHacks. So this is going to pull the main branch out as opposed to any of the others. So I'm now going to just start code. And if you are working on this as you're going along as well, there's a question here from Yurav about the mic and video being on. It's not. It's all good. Not from my perspective anyway. Yeah, so if you're following along on your machines, I'm going to take this at a reasonable pace. That if you're familiar already and you've got Node set up and you don't need to install any additional developer tools to do this. Obviously, we're going to be installing some SDKs. If you're mostly ready to go, then you should be able to follow me along. If I start going ahead and you start falling behind, don't worry about it. We can you can go through the video again afterwards and do this. And of course, there's the README to help you out. But if you want to follow along, you're more than welcome to, and ask any more questions as they come up. So let's have a look what we have in here. I don't usually do like mega repos where you have a whole lot of different applications in one repository. For demos and tutorials like this, I do, because it's easier just to check one thing out. So you'll see in here, we've actually got two applications. We've got our API, we've got our front end, and then we've got the README file and obviously a license. So let's have a look at the front end first. And down here, I'm just going to open up two little terminals side by side. We'll go into the front end in this one, and we'll go into the API on this one. This is just so we can start our development tools. So the front end, if you've ever used Gatsby before, if you haven't used Gatsby, don't worry too much about it. I won't be doing any Gatsby specific stuff. Gatsby for me is a great server-side or a static site generator that generates a React app. But sometimes if I just want to build a React app, I'll actually just start with a Gatsby app because it gives you extra things out of the box like routing and GraphQL capabilities and those kind of things. So that's why I chose Gatsby. It's one of my favorite platforms at the moment for building. If you're familiar with Gatsby or React, you'll probably recognize in the source directory here. So this is a Gatsby specific thing. Anything you put in pages automatically becomes a route. So we've got our home page, our 404 page, and our admin page. I've got some SAS here just for some styling, and we've got some components, the header, the layout, and SEO stuff. These are mostly standard across most React and Gatsby applications, so I'm not going to go into those in detail. One thing I will do, though, is I will start Gatsby develop in this one here. So Gatsby develop is kind of like npm run start or run dev. There's an error in there already. There was a problem loading the local development command. Gatsby may be installed on your site's node modules. That was the first time this has happened. The one thing I haven't done yet, this is always the fun part, is we need to do an npm install. I was testing this out earlier, and obviously I've done that already. So we need to do an npm install, and I'm going to do the same thing over on this side here. And that basically just goes through and starts installing the main things that we've defined already. So when I built my Gatsby app, by default, it would have had all these Gatsby things in there. I obviously added Node SAS for the SAS styling that I was doing, and these were added automatically. So this is mostly a default Gatsby application. The only thing I've changed in this from the default app is that I've made sure that everything's in TypeScript as opposed to JavaScript, just a personal preference. And in the API, I built that from scratch, and we basically pulled in Express, which we're using for the API, cause, because we're going to be making a request from one domain to another domain, so we need to enable cause.n for pulling in environment variables, and helmet is just a helper for looking at and managing headers and that kind of thing. So our API is now installed. So over here, if I run, I think this one is npm run dev. Let's just double check. So in our scripts over here, we've got run dev. Yep, so I'll do that. So that's going to start the API running. If you are cloning this, this is also, if you want to, a good bootstrapping point if you wanted to just get it up and running, the API to start going. And it's already been set up with a monitoring tool, essentially. So it does hot reloads when you save files and that kind of thing. I wanted to do this from scratch in case you are following along. So if you're following along, you're hopefully installing these things as well at the moment. And in a second, our Gatsby app will have all of the required modules downloaded so that we can start our Gatsby application. And once we do that, Gatsby, can't spell, Gatsby develop. This is now going to basically compile, because Gatsby is a server compilation tool based on React. It's basically going to compile our React application. Which we should then, let's just make sure that error isn't a huge problem. Okay, so there's basically an image missing, which we're not actually using. So I'm not going to worry too much about that one, but we should be able to, in a second, head into our browser and go to localhost port 8000. There we go, and we've got our shop set up. So at the moment, it's going to be making a request via the network automatically when we come to the shop here. It's making a request to localhost port. It's probably not making the request at all at the moment. So let's just dive in and see what this application is doing. So the front end, we've got our index page here. And if we scroll down, my laptop's freezing at the moment. Excuse me for a second. I just saw your npm install URL. Yes, thanks for that. I don't know what's happening over here. Let me see why. I've been having a couple of issues with my laptop today, so apologies for any interruptions we have here. I'm just going to kill code because for some reason it's not liking me at the moment. I'm just going to start it up again. So let's come back in here and we'll start code again. Hopefully it'll be a bit nicer to me this time. It'll probably give me that message again saying that it wants to do some ESLint stuff. We'll allow that. Excellent. All right, so this is our index page. This is what gets loaded when the, it's kind of what gets loaded when the main web page is the home page is requested. So we have over here our header that we've seen, what you want to buy. And then we've got a number of items that we want to allow people to buy. If we look up here, we're using useEffect. UseEffect is basically a hook that we're using that's commonly used in React when you're doing functional components to make a request to it doesn't need to be used for making API requests, but it gets run the first time the component gets loaded. And whenever, on certain situations, and I'm not going to be teaching you React here, but on certain other situations, this useEffect callback will be called. In this case, what we're doing is we're using it to, on the first load of this component, pull in information from the API. So we can see here that it's making a request to the API. Let's just double check. We don't actually have an environment file yet. So let's have a look at the environment file over here. This is a sample. So I'm just going to save this as .env. And locally, I'm running the API on port 7000, so I don't need to change that. If we have a look at the API over here, we've also got an env example over here. I'm going to just do a save as and save that as .env. So now we're telling it to listen on port 7000. So now we can start these up again. So we'll go into API and we'll run npm start dev, and we'll go into the front end and we'll run Gatsby develop. This isn't liking me now. npm start dev, npm run dev. Brain. All right, so this should now be listening on port 7000 any second. There we go, listening on port 7000. Let's have a look to see what we're getting out of the API at the moment. Resource not found because we need to make a request for items. Oops, that's not what I wanted. So the API is returning to us 3 products that you can buy. We've got a burger, let's make that a bit bigger. We've got a price, we've got a description, we've got images. So now when we come back to our page over here, if we refresh this, it's now going to make a request to that API on port 7000. It's not at the moment. Is that because Gatsby is still rebuilding? It should be fine. So we have, this is one of the things that I love about live demos, is they often fail. I tell you what it is. With Gatsby, I'm so used to using .env in almost all the projects that I use. With the Gatsby app, I haven't actually installed .env yet. So what we could do is install .env and get that working, but Gatsby will automatically pull out any .env.development file automatically. Development. So I'm just going to rename that and restart Gatsby, and that's now going to get Gatsby to pull in this environment variable. The issue we're having at the moment is because Gatsby, or React in this case, doesn't actually have access to this variable. It wasn't making a request to the correct API. So this should build fairly quickly this time. And if we refresh over here, any second now, there's a question here on npm. The knowing problem. Do you need backend knowledge like Express to use it? I think by it you mean Auth0. You don't need to know Express to use Auth0. Auth0 can be placed in a front-end app, like a single-page app. It can be used in a traditional Python app, for example, where you've got a server that generates HTML and sends it to the browser. It can be used in native apps, like a desktop native app or a mobile native app. And it can also be used for machine to machine. So if you are an API developer and you want to talk to another API, there's no user involved in that. So you can generate tokens for talking to other APIs as well. If you are working only on a single page app and you need to make a request to an API, that API is going to need to be able to accept a token. And we'll have a look at the tokens being passed through in a second. It's going to need to accept a token in order to know who's making a request. If it's a totally public API, that's fine. You don't need any authorization around making requests. But as we'll see in a second, when we come to the admin page here, at the moment I can come in and I can edit this and hit save changes. And the property here has been updated to say, to be plural now. It now says burgers. Obviously, in a production environment, you wouldn't want just anybody on the internet to be able to come in and edit your menu. So there are almost always going to be API endpoints that you need to secure. And in that case, your API is going to need to understand who's issued the token and be able to verify the permissions in that token. So while you don't need to understand Express necessarily, if you want to secure an API, you'll need to understand the technology that that API is written in, or you'll need to use, if it's an API for your product, if it's something you're building over the next 48 hours, it'll have to be an API that will support the use of Json Web Tokens as an authentication and authorization mechanism. It wasn't a silly question. Thanks for the question, and I hope my answer makes sense. So as you can see now, we've got the front end up and running. So for those of you following along at home, the main thing that I forgot to do was basically just rename these environment variables and then restart the apps. So we have an application running. We've got our API over here. If I refresh this now, you'll see that it now says burgers because obviously that's updated. The way this works in the Express API is that we have, so what I've done with this for this demo is I'm just storing everything in memory in the API. The API doesn't connect to a database or anything. If I restarted the API now, it would lose all of my changes. So we have in here, for example, an item router, which has a number of routes in there. If you do a get to /items, so this items router gets called for any requests that start with items. So if you make a get request to just /items, like we have here, then it's basically going to find all of the items and return those as JSON. You can also get a particular item by ID, and then you can post, which is going to create a new one, put, which is going to update an existing one, and this is based on the ID of the item that you're posting in. So you'll notice that we don't have a reference here, for example, to the ID of the item. We're just posting the data straight in. And then we've got a delete. So you can delete an item from the database. So using these now, we can come in, let's make this a little smaller. Let me know at any point if you need me to make any fonts bigger or anything to make them readable. So we come in here and we can add a new item. We could specify the image. I'm just going to leave this all as defaults and we'll create this item. And you can see it's been added in down at the bottom in here. And then we can come in, we can hit delete and it's been deleted. On the right-hand side here, we've got the request coming through. So you can see, let me make this a bit bigger. Show the methods. Needs to be a lot bigger to be able to see those bits of text there, eh? There we go. So you can see the delete came through here with a 200, which means, okay, it's been deleted. We had the get, which is the listing, and we had the put, which was the update that we had before. That's when I edited the name burgers. And in here, there's the post. That's the one that I just created. You'll notice that the response for a post is actually 201, which is the HTTP status code for created, whereas most of the time we're looking for status codes 200, which is the OK status return. Just something to bear in mind if you're making a check on responses that are coming back. One thing that I am doing is, actually I'm not sure if I am doing it yet. I think it's in a future piece of code, is we were we'll be looking in here when we handle a delete item, for example. At the moment, we're just making a request directly using the delete method to the API to say delete item 3, for example. If we got an error at this point, we would want to find out what that error is. So a delete would return a 200, but the update in this case handles both the put and the post. So in this case, we need to check for a 200 or a 201 as a valid response. Or you could do one that has anything in the 200 range, because technically anything in the 200 range from an HTTP response, the status code means that there was not an error, whereas 300 and 400 and 500 have different meanings in terms of the types of error they have. But I'm diving too deep into the weeds at the moment. So let's have a look at adding Auth0 to the mix. So I'm going to jump over to Auth0 here. If you don't have an account already, head to auth0.com, create an account. And once you've done that, you'll end up at a getting started page that looks a little bit like this. If you then head over to the applications tab, you'll notice if you've just created your account from scratch, there'll be a sample app in there. That will actually be of type regular web application. So we won't be able to use that one if you already have it. We'll be creating our own. If you do have some already, this create application button will actually be at the top right there. If you are using an Auth0 account that you had previously, please make sure that you're not working, if you have multiple accounts, that you're not working in the tenant that's related to anything that's production. If your company, for example, uses Auth0, make sure, and if, I won't go too much into what tenants are, except to say that you can compartmentalize all your projects into separate tenants, and they have separate databases of users and separate configurations. So make sure that you're actually using the correct tenant before you continue with this, because I don't want you to accidentally break things in production by following along with this tutorial. All right, so I'm going to come in and create an application. We are working on a React app or a Gatsby app, so it's a single page application. You can give it whatever name you want, make it descriptive. I'm just going to keep it as my app at the moment because, oops, clicked outside of the box, because it's just a demo. So I'm going to create this. Now, when we get to this point here, the first thing you'll see is a quick start guide or a list of quick starts. This is automatically filtered on the type. So because we're looking at a single page application, we're seeing the quick starts for single page applications. If you in your project this weekend are going to be writing a native Android app, for example, or maybe you're doing a Python backend traditional web server that generates the HTML that gets sent to the browser, then when you select those different app types, you're going to get different suggestions of quick guides to follow. We want to follow the React quick guide. It says here that it'll take you about 15 minutes. That's probably about right. Maybe the first time, if you're not familiar with Auth0, it might take you half an hour or so. But in fact, the process for React-based applications has gotten even faster, because whereas before we had one library, one SDK for all single-page apps, which meant you had to do some specific work depending on whether you were doing a Gatsby app, React rather, or an Angular or a Vue, we now have a library specifically for React, which takes away a lot of that extra overhead. So theoretically, once you've done it a few times, you can probably implement this with React in about 5 minutes. So the first thing we need to do is, as you're following these instructions down, you'll see that the first step is to configure the callback URL, the logout URL, and the allowed web origins. So if we jump up to the top, I'll show you where those get set, and then I'll explain what they do. So the callback URL, when you look at an OAuth authentication process, there are 3 components involved in any kind of OAuth communication. There's the browser, which is you interacting with the various websites, or your client or your customer. And then there's the web server that they're trying to connect to. In this case, this could be your single page app. And that's what in identity terms is called the identity client, because it's the client of the identity. Your user might be the client of your web app, but in the identity space, that's the client. And then you have an identity provider, which in this case is Auth0. So the way authentication works is these two generally don't talk directly to each other. Is when your customer comes along, or your user comes along and they go to your website, they'll make a request to log in, and your website will then return a redirect to the Auth0 identity provider. And at this point, the user will log in. In order for the Auth0 identity provider to pass information back to the application that your user is trying to log into, it will return, after that login, via a redirect via the browser again, an authorization code. And that authorization code can then be used by your application. You don't need to worry about the details here. This is just under the hood what Auth0 does for you and the SDKs do for you. That authorization code can then be used in a request directly to the identity provider to request the tokens. So it says, I've got this auth code. Auth0 will say, well, I know that I just generated this auth code when Ben logged in. Therefore, I'm going to send you an identity token and an access token for Ben. And that then goes back into your application. So the important thing here is that once I've logged in, if we just rewind a little, that authorization code that gets sent back, we need to define where that authorization code is allowed to be sent. Because if we don't limit that, then the authorization code could go to the wrong endpoint. It could go to the wrong server if there's some kind of attack in the middle during that redirect via the browser. So the original login request will say, once you're logged in, redirect back to this point here. And Auth0 will then check that request of where to send it back to. Is that in my list? Is that whitelisted? Am I allowed to? And if yes, then I will. So that's what the callback URL is, essentially. It's a very long way of describing what it is. But essentially what it's doing is it's protecting the authorization code from being sent to the wrong server. So in here, I'm going to put in localhost port 8000, because that's where our application is running. Logout URL is almost exactly the same. It basically defines where the user can be redirected to after they click the logout button. Same thing, anywhere on our website on port 8000. And finally, the web origin. Say, for example, you have a single page app and somebody right-clicks and opens in a new tab. If you think about how the JavaScript functions at that point, when the person's logged in for the first time, those credentials, not the credentials, the tokens are stored in memory in the single page app. If you right-click open in a new tab, it reloads the web page, and that instance, that tab within your browser, doesn't have access to the memory of the application running in the first tab, because for security, they can't. That browsers won't allow that to happen. So technically, the user's now logged out. Or let's say they close the browser completely and they come back 3 minutes later and they go back to your web application. The memory of who's logged in has gone. The state is lost. So what you can do, or what the Auth0 SDK will do, is it'll make a silent request in the background back to Auth0 and say, hey, do you still have a session? Because Auth0 is a traditional web application. It can create a session with your user. So it'll say, do you still have a session with the user who's currently trying to log in? And Auth0 can say, yes, here, have some tokens. Or no, you're going to have to redirect them to a login page. In that case, we only want the request for the question, do you still have a session, to come from a source that we trust. And in that case, again, that's our server. So that's what the web origin does. I hope that breaks down what the purpose of these three are. Often in documentation, you'll see that these need to be filled in. And I think sometimes it's useful to understand why we're filling them in and what the purpose is, because it helps you understand the process and also feel more secure that it is secure. Now, one key thing, you need to come down to the bottom here and click Save Changes. And then we'll scroll back up to the top and back up to the Quick Start. So at this point, if during this weekend you decide to do a React app and not a Gatsby app, you can follow the React app guide fully. Of course, you can also follow click the wrong button. You can also follow the other guides here. So we've got one for Angular, JavaScript, and Vue. So choose whichever one you're using for your single page app, or if you're using a different type of technology. With Gatsby, though, there's a slight difference. Because Gatsby is, you have to build it first. Gatsby is a build process that generates a functioning React app. So there are a couple of changes. One thing I'll do is I will share with you in the chat the Auth0 Git, this one here. So this is the, if you've ever seen automatically generated documentation, you'll be familiar with this style. This is the more hardcore documentation for the library that we're about to use. So you can come in, that's going to go to the wrong place. Let's send it here. All right, so this one here is going to help you with understanding what you can do once you've installed the SDK. The Quick Start is a really good way of getting authentication added into your application. If you want to delve deeper and understand what other functions are available, there's obviously a whole lot of other documentation on the Auth0 website. It's very helpful for me. Even before I joined Auth0, the documentation was the killer feature for me. It's quite easy to follow. And as you'll notice in a second, there's also a lot of helper functionality built into the documentation in certain spaces that'll even inject custom data. I'll just show you. So when we go further down here, you'll see there's you can just copy and paste this. If we were doing a React app now, we could just copy and paste this directly in, and it's automatically included the domain and the client ID for this particular instance that we've just created. It doesn't say insert your ID here, paste it in for you, because it can. So I'm going to jump back over to this one, and I'm just going to do a string search in this page for Gatsby, because there's this link here, which is, it actually helps you on protecting a root for an endpoint. But the key part in here is that it also gives you the content you need for Gatsby Browser. So if we jump back into the code, I'll show you what Gatsby Browser is. So it's a file down in the root here. Like I say, Gatsby does server-side rendering of your, I shouldn't use server-side rendering. I mean, it does do server-side rendering, but what it does is it uses a build process in order to statically generate your website. In order to do that, it needs, during the build process, to pretend in a way that it's a browser. And you can override the way that it does certain aspects of that browser handling in this Gatsby Browser.js file. So I'm just going to copy all that text in, and then we'll go through what it actually means. But also before that even works, I skipped a step here. We need to install the Auth0 React module. So I'll just copy that, and I'll come down here, and I'm going to paste that in down at the bottom. So we're installing that into the front end. And while that's happening, it shouldn't take long, but while that's happening, let's have a quick look at what's happening up here. So obviously we're integrating, this is a React app, so we need to pull in React. Once we've installed this, this library, we're going to get a number of objects, components that we can use. One of those is the Auth0 provider. So if you think back to a couple of years ago in a React app, if you wanted a component at the bottom, so you can have components inside components inside components. If you want one of these bottom components to have access to information from a component 3 or 4 levels up, you'd have to pass that down through each component. There was no easy way of getting it directly into a subcomponent, which meant that every component in between had to be aware of it. And if you change the structure of your application, then sometimes things would break. A provider is something you can wrap around the whole application, and now every component automatically gets access to this when it makes a suitable request for it. So what we're doing is we're wrapping the root element of the whole Gatsby application, or the React application, which is passed in as the element to this, this function. So we're going to render this element, but we're going to wrap it in the Auth0 provider. This is going to allow any component inside our application to have access to this Auth0 provider. And what the Auth0 provider does is it configures it defines the configuration that allows the Auth0 SDK to talk to the Auth0 server to do all the things that it needs to do for your identity stuff. So we've got in here the Auth0 client ID and the domain that we saw before. If we skip back to the quick start here, that's these parts here. So I'm going to copy those. But rather than putting them in directly here, best practice is to put them in environment variables. In our local development, we put that into a file. If you're putting this into production, if you're pushing it into Vercel or Netlify or any kind of system like that, then you'll define them as variables for the app at that point there. So we'll come in here and we'll define these. So I'm just going to paste these in. Now, if you are using Gatsby, one thing to remember is that any environment variables you define in here are available to Gatsby, but they won't be available to React unless they're prefixed with Gatsby underscore. And that's a security mechanism. You might have a secret key, for example, that allows your Gatsby application to connect to a CMS to pull down data, and that'll then build some static pages, but you don't want that API to be published to through the React app. In this case, the domain and the client ID are required by the React app. So I'm going to prefix these with Gatsby underscore. And we'll call this Auth0 domain. And this one will be Gatsby underscore Auth0. Oops, Auth0. Where's my 0 button gone? There it is. Client ID. Typing is not necessarily always one of my strong points. All right, so I'm just going to save that and we'll restart Gatsby down at the bottom here. That's going to load the new environment variables in. And we now also have the npm module for the Auth0 React installed. So we'll come over here, and instead of this, we'll now want to pull in process.env.gatsby Auth0. What was this? There's the domain, and then we'll copy that. Yes, this workshop is being recorded. Client ID, and I've noticed I've made a typo in here. We don't want those brackets. All right, so we've now defined, we're passing into the Auth0 provider what the domain is that we want to connect to, the Auth0 tenant in this case. And we've defined the client ID so that when somebody tries to log in, Auth0 knows which client configuration to load to know whether or not to let them log in. We also want to tell Auth0 where the user should be redirected to once they have correctly logged in. And we're basically going to use the JavaScript window.location.origin, so they're basically redirected back to where they came from. That's the simplest way. And one other change that we need to do for Gatsby, and remember, I just copied and pasted this in, so I'm just explaining this, but you can copy and paste it in as well. This is basically using, because Gatsby does routing differently to React, we're basically using the navigate mechanism here from the Gatsby module, in order to make sure that when people are returned, when people return back to our application from having done a login, for example, that we can make sure they're sent back to the right place. It's just a little callback that we define up here and then pass into the provider here that just handles that all for us. So in essence, that's all we had to do. That's Auth0 now implemented. I'm just going to close that and not save changes. That was the API file I was messing with before. So Auth0 is now implemented, but of course, there's no login button and there's no protected endpoints or pages. So let's come in. Let's just jump back over to our web app here and see what it looks like. So if I hit refresh, we can see nothing changes. Yeah, nothing changes. What we want to do though now is let's make the admin page protected so that only logged in people can get to the admin page. Now, like I mentioned, there's a whole lot of stuff in the new library that makes it really easy to do this in React or in Gatsby in this case. So I'm just going to scroll to the bottom here. Don't worry too much about the existing code in there. It's basically just the layout for, in this case, the table of data here. So we're exporting the default admin page here at this point. What we can do is from, if we come up to the import here, we can import with, I can't remember what it's called, but if we complete this first, Auth0 React, we can import with authentication required. So this is now being imported from the SDK that we just installed. And if I copy that, we come back down to the end of the page, and I just say, I want authentication required on the admin page and hit save. That's all we have to do. And if I switch back to the web app over here now, and we click on admin, without doing anything else, I'm now being redirected to the login page. So that's your admin page protected now. All we did was we modified that Gatsby Browser page, stuck in some environment variables, and wrapped the export of the component with authentication required. So I'm going to come in here. If you're doing this for the first time, or you've just created your Auth0 account for the first time, you won't have any users. You'll be shown a login page. We'll see that in a second. You'll need to go to sign up to create an account instead of signing up. But yeah, now so now we're authenticated to Auth0, and if we have a look in our network log over here, you can see we're starting to make some requests to the Auth0 endpoint, and this one here is making a post request for a token. So remember before when I said that the authorization code is returned to the application can then request use that token to exchange it, that authorization code to exchange it for tokens. That's what's happening at this point here. So if we open this up and have a look what's going on inside, again, you don't need to worry about this. I just want you to see the process and what kind of information is being returned. So the request here makes a, am I looking at the right one? Yep, it makes a request to the Auth0 test, the Dechrai test at Auth0. And what it's passing in is a request for auth token. And the request payload itself, because it's a post request, includes the client ID, so that's the application, the code, that's the authorization code that got returned, a code verifier, which is determined by the SDK. And then it basically says, I want to use this authorization code. I want to use an authorization code flow in order to retrieve a token. And the response is this token. We get an access token here, an ID token rather. jwt.io is a tool written by one of my colleagues. I'll just paste this in here and copy that for you all in case you want to use that. That's a really good way of looking at what's going on inside a JSON Web Token. If you're not familiar with what JSON Web Tokens are, they are 3 components separated by a full stop. You have a header, a payload, and a signature. The header and payloads are essentially, they're base64 URL encoded. Don't need to worry about that. But essentially what they are is an encoded version of JSON. And the payload defines all the things that we know about the user who just logged in. There's the email address. From that email address, if you're familiar with Gravatar, it's basically a mechanism run by Automatic, the people behind WordPress. And it allows people to define a standard profile picture against their email address. So in my case, I've got a Gravatar against my ben@dechrai.com email address. And this URL here, I think those are basically points to my profile picture. So that gets pulled out automatically by Auth0. I didn't have to do anything for that. Auth0 does that for you. You can see whether or not when I signed up, I got an email saying, please confirm your email address. I haven't clicked on the confirm link, so this is false. If I had clicked on it, it would say true. So now you also know whether or not the person who's logged in actually has access to that email account, or at least has proved that they have access. The key item for you, ignoring Gatsby, ignoring the APIs, whatever technology you're using, when you log somebody in through Auth0, or any other identity provider for that matter, there's a standard key value pair that gets sent through in the identity token. And the key is SUB, and it stands for subject. And that's the subject of the token. In this case, I'm the subject of the token because I just logged in. So this string here will always be the same. Every time I log in, this is always the string that comes back. So if you need to store stuff in your databases to remember about me, for example, let's say you're writing a very silly accounting software. It has to be silly because there's a SillyHacks. But let's say you're writing some kind of accounting software and you need to store a list of accounts and a list of transactions. The transactions are going to belong to accounts if we're looking at a relational database model. The accounts are going to belong to a user. So you're going to still need a user model in your database somewhere, but you don't need a username and password. All you need is the subject. So then when I log into Auth0, Auth0 then provides your application with my identity token. From that identity token, you pull out the subject, and the value of that subject you can then look up in your database. I hope that makes sense. So it's a much easier way. You don't have to worry about the security of the password. You don't have to worry about decrypting or what kind of a hashing mechanism you're using. You don't have to worry about creating your own password reset pages or password change pages or any of those things. So that's what the JSON Web Token is. Let's come back in over here. So what we can do now is we can use this JSON Web Token to find out who the user is. But you'll notice here we also get an access token, and this doesn't look like a JSON Web Token. This is what we call an opaque token. And unless you define an API that also requires access to this access token, you're going to get an opaque token. Let's have a look at how we can now secure our Express API so that we can get a JSON Web Token into our Gatsby app or our React app, so that we can then send that to the Express API so that Express can make sure that we're logged in. Because at the moment, Express doesn't know that we're logged in. It's a whole different website. It's running on port 7000 instead of port 8000. In full domain name terms, you could be running mywebsite.com and api.mywebsite.com, which are essentially 2 different websites. Therefore, cookies aren't going to be shared. You don't want to anyway. I mean, you could change the way the cookies are defined, but from a security perspective, JSON Web Tokens are what you want to use in this case for verifying or giving APIs information about the users that are interacting with those APIs. Right, let's jump back into the application over here. So we've secured our admin page. Before we do that though, before we update the API, I think we probably need to add a couple of extra things in here, like maybe a logout button. So let's have a look at the header. So the header here, you can see you've got home and admin. That's these 2 links here. So let's come in and we want to add a couple more. In this case, we're going to use buttons as opposed to links because we're going to be using onClick, and onClick is most easily associated with a button. So we want to do some kind of onClick handler. We'll work out what that is in a second. And we want this to be the logout button. And let's copy and paste this We're going to do a different one for login. Right. So before, actually, the other thing I'm going to do is this here is just returning directly a whole load of JSX or the components. I'm going to wrap all of this in braces, and we're going to return here. So this is doing exactly the same as before. I've just put it into functional braces so that we can add more code into this function. So if we just go back to the admin TSX, you can see that at the top, we used this Auth0 React. Another thing that we can get, as well as with authentication required, let's come back in here, is we can import from, it's not going to autocomplete unless I put this bit in, from Auth0 React. There's another one in here called use Auth0. So this is a hook that will allow us to get access to functions and attributes that sit inside what Auth0 currently knows about the state of the user, whether or not they're even logged in, those kind of things. And we're going to pull out of the use Auth0 hook a couple of things. So the main thing we want to find out first is it still loading? So when your application loads for the first time, the SDK for Auth0 is going to load up, and it's going to talk to Auth0 server to say, do we know anything about the current user? And at that point, it's still loading information about the state of the Auth0 user and what we know about all the things going on to do with identity and authentication. At this point, we don't know if the user's logged in or logged out, so we don't want to show anything. So we can say, if it's still loading, then we can hide these buttons. So let's come in here, and we'll say, this one is hidden if it's loading, and we'll hide this one if it's loading as well. But that's not very helpful to us. We actually want to show it at some point. So we can also find out if the user is authenticated. So in this case here, if it's the logout button, that's when the user is authenticated. So if we're loading, hide it. And if we're not authenticated, then hide it. In this case here, we want to say if it's loading, hide the login button. Or if we know the user is, I think I just got this the wrong way around. If they are authenticated, they should log out. Yeah. So let's change these around. So if they're, no, I was right. If they're not authenticated, hide the logout button. It's a bit of a double negative. If they are authenticated, hide the login button. But then what do we do when we click on the logout or the login button? Well, the logout button is quite easy. We just pull in logout. And here we can then say they should, not console log, logout. So one click, call logout, which is pulled in from use Auth0. For login, there are two ways you can do this. There's login with Popup and login with redirect. Personally, I prefer login with redirect. What it'll do is it'll redirect the whole application, the main web page that you're looking at, the browser tab. It'll redirect the content of that directly to the Auth0 page. Whereas a Popup is going to launch a Popup, which some browsers might stop. It's going to then try and talk back to the main parent page. It's not so much that a security it's less secure to do it that way. It's just that in some situations, the Popup might not launch. There's a couple of questions about whether the usability might be as easy. I prefer with redirect because at least I know that whatever browser they're using, a redirect is going to work. So I'm going to use login with redirect. And down here, we'll say if they click on the login button, then we want to call in login with redirect. So I'm just going to hit save on that. If we come back in over here, we can now see the logout button. If I click on the logout button, it's not very nicely styled at the moment, but that's okay. We now have a login button. And if I click on the admin page, it's still visible. We could hide it. We could put some code in here to hide this if the person's logged out as well. But it still does the automated, the forced login. So this is the login page you'll see. We didn't see it the first time because I'd previously already logged into my Auth0 tenant. And this is the sign up button you'll need to use if you haven't already created a user in your account. Those users are the users for this tenant. So under user roles, users, this is not your Auth0 login. This is the login that people will have to log into your application. So that's why you might need to sign up because that account might not exist. I already have an account though. So I'll just log in. Oops. You're very quiet in the questions, so please do ask questions if you have any. If not, that's fine. I will carry on going. We're about an hour in, so almost coming up to the hour in. We're on track at the moment to get the API to check the Json Web Token, and then we're going to do a second step to even put in some permissions checking so that only certain people can edit and only certain people can delete. All right, so we've got our login working again. We've seen that. We've got our logout button. So let's now have a look. If I made this button available, even while I was logged out, it would still work because the API isn't checking the JSON Web Token. The API doesn't even have the JSON Web Token yet. So let's secure our API. So under the, let's just refer to, I've just lost my notes. Excuse me for a second. All right, so what we're going to do is let's come in here and the auth, which is not going to work because these are still changed. So I'm just going to undo. I'm basically going to step. So we were looking at the main branch. We're now going to step to the auth branch for the next part of the demo. So I'm going to undo all the changes that I made, which will be redone when I check out the auth branch. So let's just discard these, undo that. And then we'll check out the auth branch. Right, so we still have our env.development here. We'll see now that in env.example, we've got a couple of extra things. So we'll implement those in a second as well. And in the API, our env file before had port 7000. We're going to be adding in some Auth0 stuff here. So I'll just do that on this. No, let's do the API first. So we're in exactly the same situation as we were before. If I go back to the web app over here and we refresh, I need to restart the restart Gatsby and restart the API. Let's just wait for that to load. We'll be good to go. All right, so we've configured the application now. Let's have a look at how to configure an API. So what I'm going to do is come into the API section. We want to define an API here. Whereas before, when we defined here our application, this was not creating the application, but it was defining the configuration so that our Gatsby app or our React app had something to talk to. It had some kind of configuration. Auth0 knew how to interact with it. We also need to define our APIs for the same reason. We need Auth0 to know which APIs exist within our tenant, within our ecosystem of services, so that we can configure permissions around it and also have the access token that gets sent back to the Gatsby app defined to be usable by these APIs. You'll see exactly what I mean by that in a second. So we're going to create a new API. The name here doesn't really matter what it's called, so I'm just going to call it API. The identifier doesn't necessarily need to be the URL of the API you're using. Generally, that's what we use because it's easy to look it up, but it can be any identifier. Conventionally, though, we'll use typing and talking at the same time is always fun. We'll use the, I'll just stop typing and talking at the same time. We'll use the URL that we have, port 7000 running over here for our API, and we're going to define that in here. I'm going to leave this. I won't go into whether or not to use HS or RS-256. My recommendation usually is, unless you want to look into it further, most of the time RS-256 is a better option for you. I'm happy to talk about that later if we have time, if you are wondering what the difference between the two are. So I'm going to create this, and that's the minimum that we need to do. If you're doing a native app or a conventional Python, PHP type app, then you'll need to come in and allow the application to talk to it. And that happens over here, where in this case, when I created this API, Auth0 created this test application for you automatically. We won't be using that because it's not the kind of configuration we need. We've already got our application defined over here. Let me just open this in a new tab. So we've got the this is where my internet starts slowing down. So we've got my app, which is the single page app we're configuring. It's created automatically this machine-to-machine API key client. We're not going to be using that, but you will notice that it is possible to authorize and deauthorize. If you had a native app configured or a standard web app configured, they would also show up in here, and you would need to specifically authorize those clients to talk to this API. Single page apps, you don't have to do that with. So in our case, we don't need to do any configuration of here, but that's something to look out for if you're not doing a single page app. We will come back to the quick start though, and if you're doing a Node application, which we are doing in this case, this is essentially all the code you need to secure an Express app. What's happening is we've already got the Express and the app defined. If you've built your own Express app before, you'll be familiar with these. We're pulling in two libraries here, and you'll notice that neither of them are Auth0 specific. So the Express app doesn't really care that it's Auth0. Express is just getting a Json Web Token, and it wants to verify that Json Web Token is valid, hasn't expired, and then from that it can pull out information on who the user is. So Express JWT is a library that you can use to allow Express to pull the JWT tokens out of the headers automatically. And JWKS is a JSON web key server, I think, something like that, or a JWT web key server, which is basically a way for the Express application to make a request to a server at a known endpoint to say, hey, I need the public key for this token or for this, this JSON Web Token so that I can verify that the signature is valid. And we'll see how that gets used in a second. So from the Express JWT, we're going to get this JWT function, which allows us to verify whether or not a JSON Web Token exists and is valid. Into that, we need to provide a secret because, as we saw before, a JSON Web Token has a signature, and that signature is based on the header and the payload, so that if the payload gets changed, the signature is invalid, or we can detect that the JSON Web Token has been tampered with. We want to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with. So what we're doing is we're saying we need you to generate a secret, or we need to generate a signature for the header and payload. And we generate that. We don't actually do it. The library does that for us. But the Express server needs to generate this signature so it can verify it against the signature that was actually sent through in the JSON Web Token. And if they match, then we know that the JSON Web Token is fine. It hasn't been modified. So we need this secret because that's what's used for hashing. And the secret is defined in a public key because RS-256 hashing is a public-private key hashing algorithm. And we know that that can be picked up from this endpoint here. So this part here basically just returns the public key and puts it into secret. We also define the audience. The audience, essentially, consider this the server that the token has been intended for. So in this case, we intend the access token to be used at localhost port 7000. So that's our audience. We know that the token needs to be issued by our Auth0 tenant. And we know that the only algorithm that will support for the signature checking is RS-256. So based on all of these, JWT can now pull the token out of the header and it will return essentially something that resolves to either true or false. And we can put this into the app.use, which will basically stop any requests in Express if the JSON Web Token is invalid. So you can copy and paste this directly into your Express app. Now, because my application is a couple of questions, let's just see where I'm going. It's too heavy for me. The username and password you entered, those are your Auth0 details, or are they particularly made for this app? So the username and password that I entered when I logged into my application, that's for my application. That's for the shop that I'm logging into. And this can be a bit confusing sometimes. So when you create your Auth0 account, you have a username and password to get into Auth0. Auth0 then provides you a mechanism to add authentication into your application. So when you log into your application, that's a whole different username and password combination. All the users for your application are only available to your application. You have your own database of users, you have your own configuration of all your applications. It's all completely sandboxed away. If I created an application, which I have, if my tenant does not have any access to the users in your tenant, and the tenant is basically that thing that I mentioned before, which is where you collect, where you store all of your applications and APIs in. Good, I'm glad that works. Yeah, so because the Express API is TypeScript, I've basically implemented exactly this, and I'll show you where this code is. I've just broken it out into a couple of different files. So we have some middleware here. And again, you don't need to understand middleware or how this works. You'll just see that the code that I've got is exactly the same, except it's in TypeScript. If you're writing your Express API in plain JavaScript, you can copy and paste this into an index.js. You can just run node space index.js and run just this file by itself, and it'll work. So over here, we have our middleware check. Oops, I keep opening the compiled files. So this is where we're doing the check JWT, and we're pulling in the URL here from our Auth0 issuer, which, according to this here, is ben.dechrai.test.auth0.com. And we're making sure that it's generated for the audience that's specified. So that's why over in the end file here, we're going to define these two. And this one here needs to be this one. So what we're doing now is every time a request comes in, the JSON Web Token is going to be checked to make sure that it's intended for the API and that it was generated by our Auth0 tenant. I'm just going to, actually I need to run Npm Install again. Make sure I've done that over on this one too. Yes, Hauschel's also mentioned that you can ask any questions over at the Auth0 channel in Discord. We're more than happy to take questions there as well. Right, so let's start our API. Just wait for Gatsby to finish building or finish installing its dependencies. All right, while that's happening over here, let's have a look at the code. So before, we saw that we had the router here saying if you get the home directory, or in this case, the items directory, then we'll return these. You'll notice here that we go straight from the path into the callback function. In this case here for post, we've added this check JWT. So if we jump back into this code over here, we had app.use JWT check. And as I mentioned, this will make sure that every single endpoint requires, or every single endpoint defined after this line requires authorization. So what I could do is I could come in here and do an app use JWT check. Well, I can't actually because app is defined in a different file, but we could define everything after post items to be checked. But I want to specifically say, I want this one to be checked, I want this one to be checked, and I want this one to be checked. So now delete, put, and post can only be called if I have a valid access token. Meanwhile, in our front-end application over here, there is one change that we need to make. And we saw it before when we looked at this example. We need to define when we get the user to log in the first place, we need to tell Auth0 which other audiences we wanted to talk to. So we need to define over here the Auth0 audience. I'm just going to copy that. If we jump back into our Gatsby browser, this is where we define the Auth0 provider. We have the domain, the client ID. We're now also defining the audience in here. So now when we click the login button, not only is it saying, I want to log in using this domain, this tenant, I want to log in for this client ID. We're also saying, I want the token that gets returned to me to be valid for this audience. In this case, that's the API running on port 7000. So let's start Gatsby. We've got our API running already, and we'll head back into our application here, which is currently still waiting for the application to rebuild. Is that rebuilt already? No, it's still going. That must be cached. We'll just give it another second while this rebuilds. Success. All right. Hard refresh. Make sure that's actually reloading. I'm going to assume it is. Let's log out. That's not liking me. Let's do that. What's going on? I wonder whether my browser is just being a little bit slow again. I'm going to close this tab and let's start it again. One of the beauties of development is often you'll get things going on in memory as you're switching code that don't make sense all the time. So if you ever get stuck in a position like this where it's not doing what you're expecting it to, just try restarting your browser. Or you can also do things like coming over into the storage area here and deleting all your local storage and your caches and that kind of thing. All right, let's go back to the network tab here. Okay, so we've got our application here. In this case, the admin button is hidden because the auth branch actually hides it. So we're going to click on the login button here. We're going to log in, and now we're logged in. We get the admin page. We come into admin. Now what we can do is we can click on add here, for example. Let's create this item. We can see it's been added. Let's have a look to see what went on behind the hood. So we made a post request to create a new item. We got the status 201 returned. The request that got sent in was the information that was in the form, and we'll look at where that gets generated in a second. And the response that came back was just this created. We can see in the headers that one of the other things that was sent in was this bearer token. So this is the access token. Let's jump back a step and go to, see how I find it, this one here. So you can see the BE. I'm not sure whether that is big enough on your screens, but that's the, there we go, the tooltip is helping. That's the request to Auth0 for the token. So in this case, the response that came back from the token, remember the first time we had the access token, which is a short string, and then we had the identity token, which is a longer string. Now when we look at it, we've got a much longer string for the access token. This is now a JSON Web Token. And if we investigate what's going on inside the JSON Web Token here, again, this is mostly for your information. You don't need to understand this in order to implement Auth0. You can see the payload is different now. It's not about a person, it's about access rights and what we understand about the token in terms of where it came from. So we can see the issuer here. And remember when we were looking at the things that Express wants to do, it wants to check that the issuer is valid and the audience is valid. So we have in here the issuer, so we can check that that's valid. And we can see in here that the audience now also contains localhost port 7000. So the library, that the JWT library in Express is automatically verifying this for us. And because it's able to verify the signature, it can say, look, I know that this signature here is valid. Therefore, I can trust that the data in here has not been modified. So this is our access token. And this is what we need to talk from our front-end applications, our single-page applications, to the API. Let's have a look at how that's done. Let's jump back into the admin page here. So we've got our function here that loads the items. That makes a request to /items. We don't need any authentication on that one. We've got some handlers here for when buttons get clicked. This one here is when somebody clicks on the update button, which is also the create button if it's a new product. So what we're doing is we're passing in an authorization header. Before, we were making a request and just saying, look, we're posting some JSON in. We're using put or post, depending on whether or not the item exists already. And we're passing in the information as the payload to the API. This is what we want to create. What we've added here is the authorization bearer token. So the token itself, that's the JSON Web Token that we just received when we logged in the second time. That's the longer one. It's the access token, that's the JSON Web Token. And these access tokens are also known as bearer tokens, because when it comes to authorization headers, there are a number of different ways that things can be passed through. It could be a plain text. Don't use plain text authentication headers. They're terrible. Digest. There's a couple of different ones. Bearer is the one. Basically, what bearer means is, do you have it? I am the bearer of information. In this case, your application is saying, I'm the bearer of this token. And the API can then look at the token and say, well, because you bear this token, I can trust you. That's why it's a bearer token. We're passing that in. In order to get access to this token, we're making a request to get access token silently, which is another item that we got back from the use Auth0 hook. We can go back up at the top of this code and have a look at that in a second. But essentially, this is a callback that will get the Auth0 SDK to provide to us that access token. The identity token is already provided to us in the user object, but the access token we need to get out using this callback. So we make this callback, which then returns to us a token. Then we can take that token and we can pass it into the request. For those of you fairly new to JavaScript-based applications, fetch is a fairly standard, pretty much standard now for most modern browsers, method that allows your browser-based application in JavaScript to make a call to a third party, make an HTTP request, basically. So in this case, we're saying we want you to fetch information from this endpoint. The endpoint is /items. We want to use post if we're creating a new application, and we want to pass this authorization code in so the API knows that we're authorized to make this request. There's a question from Yuvraj. So earlier we verified the user, and now we're giving the user rights to the user to fetch data. So the first time we logged in, we were verifying the user in Auth0, and the identity token that came back was usable by our front-end application in order to know who the user was. Let me just do one quick thing that's not really part of the demo, but it'll hopefully help understand something. So let's go back to the home page here. And if I come down, we look at the index page. Let's pull in. And I'm loving these questions. If I can go off on tangents and make things clearer, that's perfect. So let's just pull out the user from, not from, the use Auth0 hook. So I need to make sure that's being pulled in. So import use Auth0 from here. We're now getting the user object out of use Auth0, just 1 0 there. Now, if I come in here, let's just put in some pre-tags, and we'll do a JSON stringify. So we want to have a look at what's inside the user object. So I'll do that. Just some formatting options to make it easier to read. Now, if we come to the home page, there's an error. Why is there an error? Use Auth0 is not defined. I thought we did import use Auth0 from there. Use Auth0. Why is that not defined? Maybe I need to do a hard reload. The web page had reloaded before I pulled in from the top here. So there was an error, and then the hot loading stopped. So I just did a hard reload there. And you can see now this is the identity token. So just by default, by implementing Auth0 the way we did it the first time, just creating, adding the files to the browser text, the Gatsby Browser JS file, and then making the admin page requiring authentication. Just by doing those two things, when I logged in, this information is now available to our application through the user object. But there's no access rules or definitions in here. But all it does is it tells you about me. So in order for our front-end application to talk to an API, we need an access token. So that's what we've done in this second step, is created an access token which has different information. It has over here the audiences the access token is for and the subject. At the moment, all this is saying is that the user has logged in and they have a token. It doesn't give you any information about permissions. It's just an access token. The permission is basically yes or no at this point. Do they have an access token that's still valid? Yes, that's fine. Let them do these things. They're not silly questions. Thank you for the questions. They're great. All right, let's jump back in over here to our application. All right, I'll leave that in there. It's a bit of fun. So where were we up to? We have this access token, and yes, so in the index page here, not the index page, let's close that one again. In the admin page here, if we come back up to the top, I mentioned before the get access token silently. So in the same way as before for the navigation, for example, we pulled in the is authenticated, is loading, login with redirect, and the logout. We pulled those out of use Auth0. You can also pull out get access token silently. Now, you might be wondering how to work all these things out. I mean, there's obviously the documentation in the Auth0 blog and the Auth0 documentation, but remember the GitHub, this one here, the GitHub repository that I showed you, or the github.io pages that shows this. You'll find things like get access token silently documented in here. So how to call an API. This is essentially what we're looking at in our code. You can go through this documentation and pick all the parts out that you need. So we're using the use effect again here, and we're getting an access token. In this case, it is a callback, but you can also do things asynchronously. So in mine, I'm doing things synchronously. In this case, we're defining an async function, and inside there, we're awaiting the token. Once the token comes back, we can then pass that through in the authorization headers, and that's the endpoint that we're calling. So this document is really good for understanding how to use each of the elements. That's the core documentation, I would say, for the library. But of course, there's also the quick starts. So if we come back into the single page application over here and the quick start for React, there's all the information in here to help you through that as well. We've done the logout URLs. We've implemented, again, this is React specific, not for Gatsby, but if you're doing a React, you can just follow this through. Here it shows you how to do the login with redirect. Here's the logout button. This is showing the profile information. So I was pulling user out, and then down here, I was just doing a dump of the whole user object, but of course you can pull out user.names separately and say, hi, Ben, welcome back, things like that. Yeah, then you can come down here, and part 2 is calling the API using the access token. So you can follow the quick starts through as well. That's another option for you if you want to work out how to do that. So here we've now got the React code again. We're getting the access token, and this goes into a little more detail. So now we're getting the access token. We're getting the user details by ID. So this allows us to call a certain endpoint. So follow the documentation in the quick starts if that works for you. If not, there's 3 main places you can get it from. And it could seem overwhelming sometimes, but it all depends on which process you're going through. My recommendation would be for your application when you're starting for the first time, if you haven't used Auth0 before, is to follow the quick start and get it working in the technology of choice for you. Then move on to using the main Auth0 documentation that'll tell you more about how to use access tokens and how to do permissions-based stuff. Also, search engines are really your best friend in many ways. I was researching a bit more into roles-based access control, for example, recently, and I use DuckDuckGo for my search engine. If you use Google or Bing or whichever search engine you're using, just do a search for Auth0 followed by whatever it is you're trying to do. The documentation is probably on our blog already because we've got so much documentation there. It's just a matter of finding it sometimes. And as we keep saying, hit us up in the Discord channel as well for any help you might need. All right, let's jump back here. So we've got authentication happening here. If we, what I'm going to do, let's just try something for fun. Let's delete this one. So that delete should work. I'm going to add one. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of the functionality of the network tab in your browser, but let's create this item here. And if we come down and we look here, this is the post item. So this is where we created it. I'm going to right click on here and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to copy it as a curl request. Curl is a command line tool for making requests to HTTP requests to certain services. So if I copy that, let's have a look over here. So we've got one item in here. If I refresh this, we still have just that one additional item. It's going to take a while. There we go. Now, if I jump into a command line here and I just paste that in, you can see here that it's calling curl. It's making a request to items. It's going to do, let's see if we can find it in here. It's going to make sure it's a post request somewhere. I think data raw also implies post, but there might be somewhere hidden in here that's a post request. And then here is the data that's being passed in. So there's the JSON. So if I hit enter on this, it comes back with created. And now if I come over here and I come to the home page and then back to the admin page, we can see there are 2. So I've used the command line tool now to make a request for creating a new item. Now, if we look in here, there's the bearer token. So let's have a look. And if you use something like Postman, which is another great tool for doing these kind of requests, that'll probably be an easier way to test this kind of thing. But I'm just going to be lazy at this point because I don't actually have Postman installed at the moment. So I'm just going to delete the bearer token out of this request. It's going to take a little while because it's fairly long. But once we get to the end, and if I keep talking and saying nothing really in particular, then we won't have any silences. But we're still going. JSON Web Tokens are quite long. mostly because there's a bit of data in them. And when you base64 URL encode them, they get even longer again. We're almost to the end then now. So I'm going to slow down here. And there we go. So that's gone now. So basically, we're just now making a request, providing a user agent, doesn't really matter. We're accepting any responses, that's fine. We're sending a referrer, that's fun. This one's fairly important. So we're sending through a content type to say we're sending JSON. This is the origin that we're coming from. And here's the data that we want to post. So if I hit this now, if I actually press the enter button, you'll see here the no authorization token was found. So whereas before you didn't have to be logged in, you can see now that without the bearer token, the Express API is actively blocking this request. So that's that. Let me know if you've got any questions so far. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset this back again, because we're now going to look at role-based access control. Let me just come in over here and we're going to check out role-based access control. So if you within your product get up to the point where you've got authorization working and your API, if this is the kind of thing you're building, if you get to the point where you've got an authorization token and you know whether or not somebody's logged in a lot of cases that might be enough. Maybe you don't need to do this next bit. This next bit is if you want to allow people to log in, but not necessarily do all the things that everybody can do. In this case, we're going to change the admin system. So you have to be logged in to get into the admin system. But once you're in there, anybody can edit and update or edit and create items in the menu. But if you want to delete them, then you need to have a higher level of permissions. If that's the kind of thing you want to do, then this is where role-based access control can come in useful. And what I want to show you now is a little bit of the code, because there are some code changes, not a huge amount, and it's mostly the API. In fact, it might be all in the API. We'll find out in a second, as I remind myself as we're going through it. But most of it is about configuring it in Auth0. That's one of the beauties about Auth0 is once you've implemented the SDK, when you want to make changes to the way that it functions, you might need to do a little bit of extra code, but a lot of the time, most of it is done through configuration. And we'll have a look at some of the other configuration items, which is outside of authorization. It's still to do with identity. It's outside of this particular implementation. We'll look at things like how to add social login with Google, login with Twitter, multi-factor authentication, that kind of thing. We'll touch on that as well later. We have about 37 minutes to go. Still good on track. Keep those questions coming if you have any. All right, so let's come back in here. I'm going to run npm install just because I've changed branches and there are a couple of extra things that need to be installed. So let's have a look. This one here probably hasn't changed. We have the Auth0 React, and the rest is all the same. So this was not in the first branch, but it was in the second and third branches. And let's just check to see what's changed in the API. We had Express JWT and JWKS RSA, which were required for getting the Json Web Token and then verifying the signature. We have added another one here though. This is Express JWT Auths. Auths with a Z is authorization as opposed to authentication. Authentication is who is the person. Authorization is what can they do. So we want some authorization capabilities added into Express. So we've pulled in the Express JWT Auths module, and we've added in an extra middleware application. And this basically uses the JWT Auths module that we've just pulled in. And this one is fairly straightforward. We're going to pass in a string, which is the permission we're looking for. And JWT Auths is going to return a Boolean evaluation of whether or not the token has that permission. And then if we have a look at the router that we had over here, we had, before we were checking just, let's go back up to, down here. So before we had this, we were just saying if the path is the root directory and it's a post, then we want to call this function only if checkWT evaluates as true. Now what we're doing is we're passing in an array. We want to check multiple things. We want to check that the JWT that gets passed through is valid. We also want to check the permission. We want to check to see whether that permission is create items. So post can only be done if the user has a create items permission. Put can only be done with update items. And delete can only be done with delete items. If we just jump into the definitions here, you'll see that they're just strings. And we'll define those in Auth0 now. That's all that's been changed in the API. We're basically adding that extra check-in. So we've pulled in the express JWT auths module. We've called it here to say we want to pull out of the permissions array, and we'll have a look at what the Json Web Tokens look like once we've logged out and logged back in again with some permissions. It'll have a permissions array, which will show you all the permissions the user has. And if that permissions array contains the permission that we've sent in, then allow them to execute the function. So let's just start these two. To ignore some of these red squiggly lines, I've just got some linting or code checking errors in my configuration. The code works. It's just for some reason I'm getting errors in my IDE. Right, let's jump back in over here. So if we jump to, let's go to the top level here, applications. So this is the application we defined. Like I mentioned, when we created our API, when we defined our API rather, this definition was created, but we're not using that. If we jump back into the API over here, enabling role-based access control is just a matter of clicking the enable role-based access control. So this is now going to allow us to assign permissions and roles to the users. I mean, we can do that anyway, but it's going to allow this API to make use of those permissions and users. By default, though, it's not going to change anything in the access token that gets generated. What we want, though, is when the user logs into Auth0, for the access token that gets returned to our application to include the permissions that that user has, so that the API can verify those permissions without having to make extra calls to find out what permissions the user has. We're just going to write them straight into the Json Web Token. So we want to add the permissions into the access token. Come down and hit save. Next thing we want to do is come up to the permissions tab, and we're going to create the permissions that we want to assign to roles, and those roles we will then assign to users. So let's just come back into the code over here to verify that we're getting the right values. And if we come back into this one, so we had create items. So I'm just going to copy that, or paste that straight in. I'm mainly doing copy and paste here to make sure that I don't get any typos during the demo. Of course, you can have this to be whatever you want. As long as you define the string in here to be the same as the string that you're verifying in your application, that's fine. So this is the string you're checking. This is the scope. This is the definition. This is what you want to compare against. Description can be whatever you want. So we're going to do create items. I'm going to copy the update items. And delete items. So we've got these three permissions. My ability to speak is decreasing by the second. Yeah, well, Vipin, it's if things are going over your head now, then that's not a bad sign. It means that you're okay to get Auth0 implemented in your application. As I mentioned before, this is going the next step further. This is now getting to the point where we're doing permissions. The default implementation of Auth0 is basically just to do authentication, find out who the user is. If that's all you need for your application, that's fine. Also, with 48 hours, it might be that you don't even get to the point where you can implement the permissions-based things. And of course, as part of your submission, you can always say, we have plans to do blah and add permissions in. Remember that the scope to which you use this is dependent on many things. And if you don't get to the point where you need permissions or implement permissions, that's fine too. And yes, check out the documentation, hit us up in the Discord channel as well. This is now mainly for people who are going to get to the point where they do want to do more access control type things, which is totally possible in Auth0. And we're almost there. So if you want to stick around and just see the effect, you're more than welcome to. So we've got our permissions defined for the API now. Now we want to come down under users and roles. We're going to define some roles. I'm going to define two roles. I already have them defined, in fact. So we've got the admin and the editor. If I come into editor, I'm going to check out the permissions. I'm going to make sure that I add permissions. You need to define, so each group or each role can have permissions across a number of APIs. In this case, we've only got one API defined, and that's our API running on port 7000. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say that the editor has the ability to create items and update items. They don't have permission to delete. So I'll add those into the editor. We'll come back here. I had these set up already from previously. If you didn't have them, you'd come over to create role and just add a name or description. That's all you need to do to get the role in it for the first time. But that's an interesting little bug. I'll have to feed that one back. Cancel button doesn't work if the name is blank. All right, admin. Coming to permissions, we're going to define the permissions here for the API, and we're going to give admin permission for all three actions. So we'll add that permission there. We now have these defined. The final piece of the puzzle is to add users to those roles. Now, there's a few different ways you can do this. You can see over here already there's a users tab, and I could come in and make sure that certain users have these permissions. I'm actually going to remove myself from the admin role because I don't want admin permissions just yet. If we go and have a look at the editor, we can see over here the users, there aren't any. You can also do it directly from the users tab. So here I could come in and I could click on assign roles, and I can assign it at this point here. And yet another place you can do it is if you edit the user, you can see a list of all the roles over here. And currently I have none. You'll notice also that I could technically assign permissions to myself specifically. I generally don't recommend doing that because it makes management a lot harder. Say, for example, you've got 60 users and each one of them has had their permissions defined directly to the user. If you want to change so that all of HR could now do something else instead, you'd have to edit every user individually. So I generally recommend using roles. So in this case, I'm going to come in, I'm going to assign the editor role to my account. Now I need to log out and log back in. The main reason is we already have a token. So I need to regenerate that token. So I'm going to log out. The application is going to forget who I am. It's going to remove the token from memory. I'm going to log back in again. And I'm going to clear this log so that we can see what comes back now in the new token. So we'll see a request here for, there's options post. So here's a request for the token. And if we come in and we look at the response, let's just grab this access token and we'll paste that into jwt.io again. And you can now see the access token is almost exactly the same. There are a couple of differences. The issue time and the expiry time have changed. And also we now have this permissions array. So you can see that by default or by configuration in Auth0, I've been granted access to create and to update items. Now, if we come back into our code over here, we'll see that with create and update items, I should only be allowed to call, I should not be able to call delete items, but I should be able to call update items, and I should be able to call create items. So let's jump back into the front-end application here. We'll go into the admin page and we'll see how this works. So I can come in, I can add a new item. Let's give it a name. Don't have permission to do this. That's because I remember why this is. Remember before, you'll see down here that the post returned a 201. That's the response for created. One thing that I haven't pushed into the repository just yet, and something that you can play with if you're working with it at the moment, is the moment I'm checking to see in, let's come back into the front end, the admin page for the front end. When we do a update item here, I'm checking to see if the status is 200. Now, obviously, we also want to accept status 201. So if it's not 200 and it's not 201, then I don't have permissions. I must remember to put that back into the repository later. So we're now checking to make sure that I have permission to do this. If I don't, then I can't. Now, one thing you'll notice, though, is that if I come back in, it has actually created it. Because even though the response to me in the application was I don't have access to do it, the API still allowed me to do it. So let's just do this one more time so we can see that it's working cleanly. So I'll create item 2. We'll create the item. That's come through fine. If I scroll down, we can see item 2 down here. Now, I can also come in and I can edit. So I can change the name, save that. That's come down fine. we can see the name has changed down here. If I come through and hit delete though, it'll say I don't have permission to do this. Now again, this could be my coding error in the front-end application. So let's have a look at the network tab and see what happened here. So we got our token, and then we made a request on port 7000 to get the items. And then we posted the new items. That gave us the 201. So that was the success. This here is created. So that was the first request to create the item. Then down here, we've got the second request, which was to create item 2. And then we have the put. Put here, if we look at what the request was, we're just pushing through the changes. So item 2 edited. And again, we're getting a response back. It's actually not giving us a response. I thought it would have given us some text, but we can see in the headers, we're getting a 200 OK. And then finally here, we have the delete. And the delete, you can see we've got a 403 forbidden. So the API is now making sure that I have the correct permissions in order to perform the actions that I want to take. If I want to be able to delete them, I'm going to need to be an admin. So let's come in here and we'll delete the editor role and we'll assign a new role. I'm going to put myself in as an admin. Now, again, I'm going to need to log out and log back in because I need a new access token. So let's log out. We'll log in. And now when we look at the access token that comes back in the request here, we can see, oh, we want the post, this one here. And let's paste it in here again. And now we can see we've got create, delete, and update. They've all come through now. And if I come back into the admin page, I can come down here and I can delete this item and I can delete this item. And you can see down here, we're getting a 200 response for delete. And the items will delete from the home page. So we've got permissions working now as well. With 23 minutes left, I'm very happy to start taking any more random questions. I also want to go through, if you don't have any questions, that's fine. I've got some other things I can talk about, but I would prefer to address any concerns or questions or particular specifics that you might have. But while we wait for some of those to come through, let's have a look at the other things you can do once you've got all of this set up. And remember, as I was saying to Vipin before as well, you don't need to implement all the way up to this point. This is just for those of you who might need to do permissions level stuff. At the very least, Auth0 is going to allow you within 15 minutes to implement an SDK and secure your front-end application, so you have to be logged in to be able to do certain things in your application. Now, one thing you might want to do though is, let's bring this over here. We'll hit the login button. So by default here, you can have an email address based login. You can log in with Google or log in with Twitter. The defaults down here, I can't remember what they are. If you create your new account, you probably won't see these two. You might see Google and Facebook or something else. So you can change what these are. If you're creating a new account, then you're actually going to get a 22-day trial period where you can do a lot of the things that come with the more enterprise levels of Auth0. But after that time, you get a free-for-life free tier. So there's no worries about what happens in 22 days time. Once you get to that point, you still have plenty of flexibility in the way you can use Auth0. You can have as many users as you want in your database. We count the number of logins or the number of active users, as we call them. So if somebody changes their password, or if somebody logs in or logs out, or if somebody goes to a web page and your application requests new tokens, any of these things make that user what's termed active. And in any 1 month, you can have 7,000 active users and you still fall within the free tier. So I don't think any of you are going to hit that this weekend. If you do, you're definitely onto a winner. But there are various things that you can change. If you are on the free tier, then you have a maximum of 2 here. Otherwise, on any of the paid plans, you can go to as many as you want, and also on the free trial version. So in order to configure those, you want to come down to connections. Connections is where we store information about users. And there's four types of connections. One of them is a database. And when you create your account for the first time, out of the box, you get this username, password, authentication database. And this is where we store any users who create an account. You can add your own database connections and connect it to an external MongoDB. There are all sorts of configurations you can do. But at the moment, I want to look at social. Social allows you to allow your users to log in with a social network provider. And as you saw before, I've got Google and Twitter enabled already in my tenant. There's a whole load of different ones you can add here. So you can do login with Facebook, login with Apple, login with Dropbox. You can even come down and get some of the more obscure ones like Yammer or Evernote. So if you're writing an application for a particular type of user, you might want to define which social networks they can log in with. For example, if you're writing an application designed for business users, then maybe they're more likely to want to log in with something like a Microsoft account or a Google account. If you're writing an application for musicians, then maybe you want to, I was going to pull out the YouTube one, but obviously that's going to be Google as well. But if it's more for people who are socially active, then maybe you want to choose Twitter and LinkedIn instead. So you can pick which social networks you want. And of course, you can have 5, 20 of them during the trial period or on a paid account if you want. So these, you just come in and you can define your app ID if you want to integrate it fully with Facebook. A couple of these as well, we will actually allow you to use our developer IDs. So you can actually use Twitter or, and you can see up here, there's a little warning saying that some of them, some of the login mechanisms here are using dev IDs. This allows you to use social logins without having to define or get your own API keys. You're basically using our API keys. Not in a dangerous way, like we've created special accounts just for dev keys to be used, but you won't want to put this into production. You'll need to configure this properly for production to get rid of this warning at the top there. But essentially, you've got all of these different social connections that you can log in via, or your users can log in via. If you want to do something with a bit more authentication or a bit more security, you might want to do something like multi-factor authentication. And in this case here, the easiest one is probably to do an email-based or a phone message-based authentication. You can come in here, you can enable phone message. At the moment, because I'm out of my free trial, I would need to upgrade my subscription for some of these things. But on the free trial, on the 22-day trial period, you're going to be able to use any of these. And this will allow you to send your users an SMS to verify who they are to log in. Other things you can do is rebrand the login page. So at the moment, this looks very much like a standard Auth0 login page. You've got the Auth0 logo, you've got the standard blue, which is the default color for a, actually it might not be standard blue. I've probably changed it a few times. But you can change those. So if you come into universal login on the side here, this is where you define, that's what we call that login page. It's a universal login mechanism. You can define what it looks like. So you can come in and you can change the page background color to, let's say, some very nice green of some sort. I don't know how nice that actually is. And let's change the primary color to red, because that's going to clash with green. And I'm a very bad designer. So let's do that. I could also provide a company logo. So one thing that we did have over here, I think we have a, let's just copy this URL, copy image location, and we'll use this as a logo. There we go. That's very pretty. Should be valid HTTPS. Okay, so it's because it's not running on my local host, it's giving an error there at that point. I don't actually know whether I'll be able to save it. No, I can't. So let's come into search for a logo. Any logo will do. Let's go with this one. Copy link location, and we'll put that in here. All right, save changes. Right, now when I come back into the login page, we've got our lovely green and red scheme, which for the designers out there, I apologize for the headache I'm giving you right now. I've defined my own logo. You can see here that we're logging into Ben Test. That's the name of the tenant that's defined up here. And the welcome text. You could go even further and modify these, the HTML behind these. So you can come into the login tab and hit the override or the customize button. And now you have full access to the HTML that generates the login page. So you could set background images. That's one that I've seen done quite often, which really quickly makes your login page feel a lot more like your application. You can make it look like your website. Maybe you can take a screenshot of your web application and create a slight blur effect on that, save that out as a PNG or a JPEG, host that somewhere, and that can become your background image to your login page. And then it looks almost like the Auth0 login is floating over the top of your application. So that can be a nice effect. So have a try with a few of those things. I won't go into things like single sign-on integrations, just because you're probably not going to get into anything like that over the weekend. There's also other things you can do, like linking directly into enterprise connections. Do you want to get your user information out of an ADFS server, for example? There's a whole lot of configuration stuff you can do here. I won't go into all of them. I think if you can get Applications tab just to get your application secured, and then start looking at things like multi-factor authentication to keep yourself a bit more secure, then that's going to be a great starting point for your project this weekend. I hope you have a lot of fun. I'm not sure which nice trick. Oh, you're talking about the background image. I think that's a really clever hack, because you're actually looking at a totally different web server, because it's hosted by Auth0, which allows us to keep it a lot more secure. It's one of the issues if you had the login page on your own website, for example, is you can get cross-site scripting attacks or malicious plugins in your browser or these kind of things. So by having full control over your login page, we can keep that a lot more secure, but you can still make it look like your login page or like your web application. So I like that. Yeah, so hit us up in Discord. We're more than happy to take questions and help you out. As I mentioned at the beginning, my colleague Sam is probably going to be the more active mentor when it comes to the Auth0 side of things. I'll be around again towards the end to help the organizers with judging. I've had a lot of fun showing you the ropes on Auth0. I know that I went into some fairly deep concepts, and I'm glad you stuck it out with me. Even if the only thing you get out of this is how easy it is to implement Auth0 just for a login mechanism for your application, that's probably the minimum you need in order to secure your application this weekend. And yeah, have a lot of fun. Thanks.